There's a moment happening right now in American households that doesn't make the evening news, but shows up every week at the register. You're buying the same items you bought 2 years ago. The cart looks the same, but the total doesn't, and it's not coming back down. Between 2020 and 2024, egg prices doubled, then dropped, then doubled again. Lettuce went from $1.29 to $3 overnight after a single weather event in California. Potatoes held steady until fuel costs pushed transportation margins past the breaking point. What you're watching isn't a supply shock anymore, it's the new equilibrium. And the equilibrium is built on systems that were never designed to stay affordable under pressure. For most of the 20th century, food price stability wasn't an accident. It was policy. The American agricultural system was engineered to produce caloric abundance at suppressed cost, and it worked until the variables it couldn't control started compounding. Fuel, fertilizer, consolidation, transportation. Now you're not just paying for food, you're paying for the fragility of the system that moves it. But there's another framework, an older one, and it doesn't require you to trust the supply chain, the retailer, the distributor, or the weather in California. It requires about 60 square feet of ground and a shift in how you think about what food is supposed to do. These are 7 crops that behave like insurance when the system doesn't. Number 7. Potatoes. In 1845, Ireland lost 1 million people because potatoes failed. That's not a case against potatoes. That's a case study in what happens when an entire population depends on a single crop with no redundancy and no soil diversity. But here's what doesn't get mentioned. Before the blight, potatoes fed more people per acre than any grain in Europe. They still do. 100 square feet of potatoes can yield up to 100 pounds under average backyard conditions. That's not commercial farming. That's no-till, no fertilizer, medium-effort soil. In energy terms, you're looking at 40,000 calories from a plot the size of a small bedroom. Wheat doesn't do that. Corn doesn't do that. Lettuce isn't even in the conversation. Potatoes were adopted across Europe in the 1700s, not because they were delicious, but because they were economic survival. They grew in poor soil. They stored for months in cool darkness. They didn't require milling, processing, or threshing. You grew them, you dug them up, you ate them. There was no middleman and no supply chain. In the United States, potatoes became a supermarket commodity in the 1950s when centralized distribution systems made it cheaper to ship Idaho russets nationwide than to grow them locally. It worked because fuel was cheap and infrastructure was subsidized. That equation is reversing. A 5-pound bag of russet potatoes that cost $2 in 2019 is now $4.50 in most metro areas, and that's before you account for quality degradation and storage losses in transit. But if you grow them yourself, the cost is the seed potato. 2 pounds of seed stock runs about $6 and produces 50 to 70 pounds in return. You're looking at a 10-to-1 return on input, and the labor is spread across 3 months. You don't water them daily. You don't weed them constantly. You hill them twice and wait. Potatoes are insurance that stores itself underground until you need it. Number 6. Dry beans. Beans don't inspire passion. They don't show up in food photography. They're not trendy. But they were the baseline calorie source for every non-grain-dependent civilization in the Western Hemisphere, and there's a reason they never left. A single bean plant produces about half a cup of dried beans. That doesn't sound like much until you realize that beans don't grow 1 to a square foot. They grow 8 to 12 per square foot if you're using bush varieties, and they grow vertically forever if you're using pole beans. A 4x4 plot of bush beans will give you close to 25 pounds of dried protein across a summer. That's 120 cups, 40,000 calories, for 16 square feet. During World War II, the United States government didn't just ask Americans to grow vegetables, it specifically promoted beans because they were shippable, stable, and calorically strategic. A pound of dried beans has 1,500 calories, and doesn't spoil for years if kept dry. You can't say that about tomatoes. You can't say that about squash. Beans also do something almost no other food crop does. They fix nitrogen. Their roots pull nitrogen from the air and deposit it in the soil, which means they don't just feed you, they feed the ground for the next crop. In an economic sense, beans pay rent backward. The grocery store price for dried beans has stayed relatively stable, but stable doesn't mean accessible when you're on a fixed income and every other cost is rising. A pound of pinto beans that cost 89 cents in 2018 is now $1.70. It's still cheap in absolute terms, but it's doubled. And if the diesel cost to move those beans from Idaho to your regional distributor goes up another 30%, that price isn't staying where it is. If you grow them, the seed cost is negligible. A $5 packet of bean seeds will plant 200 row feet. You'll harvest more beans than you can eat in a year, and you'll do it without fertilizer, without pesticides, and without worrying whether the truck made it to the distribution center on time. Beans are the crop that doesn't ask for help. Number 5. Winter squash. Squash doesn't get respect in modern agriculture because it's too bulky to ship efficiently and too variable to automate. It's a nightmare for logistics. But it's a dream for households. A single butternut squash plant will produce 8 to 12 squash across a season. Each squash weighs 2 to 4 pounds. That's 30 pounds of food from one plant, and that plant takes up about 9 square feet if you let it sprawl. 3 plants will feed a family of 4 for 3 months if you're using squash as a base carbohydrate. Winter squash was a staple crop for indigenous agriculture across North America for 3,000 years, not because it was easy to grow, but because it was easy to store. You didn't need refrigeration, you didn't need canning, you didn't need a root cellar. You grew it in summer, you harvested it in fall, and it sat on a shelf in your kitchen until February without rotting. The American food system stopped prioritizing squash in the 1960s when frozen vegetables became the efficiency standard. Freezing required industrial infrastructure, which required capital consolidation, which required margin optimization. Squash didn't optimize. It was too heavy, too seasonal, too absurd in shape. So it got pushed to the edges. Now it shows up at the grocery store as a premium item. Organic butternut squash is $4 a pound in most urban markets. You're paying for weight, for transportation, for the inefficiency of a crop that doesn't fit the system. But if you grow it, you're paying for seeds. A packet of squash seeds is $3. It plants 10 to 15 hills. You'll pull 200 pounds of squash from a backyard plot the size of a parking space, and you'll store it without electricity until spring. Winter squash is a refusal to participate in the cold chain. Number 4. Garlic. Garlic is a small crop with a disproportionate return, and it operates on a cycle that makes it almost immune to the risks that kill everything else. You plant garlic in October. It sits dormant through winter. It grows in early spring when nothing else is up yet. It's ready to harvest in June, which means it's out of the ground before the summer heat stress that kills your tomatoes and before the late-season pests that destroy your beans. It doesn't care about your watering schedule. It doesn't care about your soil quality, it just grows. A single garlic bulb separates into 8 to 12 cloves. Each clove becomes a full bulb. If you plant 1 bulb, you harvest 12. If you plant 12, you harvest 144. The math is exponential, and the input cost is 0 after the first year because you're replanting from your own harvest. Garlic was used as currency in ancient Egypt. It was distributed to laborers building the pyramids because it was calorie-dense, medicinal, and shelf-stable. Roman soldiers carried it. Medieval peasants stored it. It was economic bedrock in every food system that wasn't based on grain monoculture. In the modern American supply chain, 90% of the garlic sold in supermarkets comes from China. It's shipped frozen, bleached to look white, and treated with methyl bromide to prevent sprouting. It's cheap because labor costs in Shandong province are a fraction of what they are in California. But that supply chain is a dependency, and dependencies become liabilities when logistics costs spike. In 2021, garlic prices jumped 30% in 6 months because of container shortages and port delays. It wasn't a garlic problem, it was a everything problem. And if you were buying garlic every week, you felt it. If you grow garlic, you're not in that system. You plant it once and you're supplied for years. A pound of seed garlic costs $12. It plants a 30-foot row. You'll harvest 8 to 12 pounds, which is more garlic than you'll use in a year unless you're canning or selling. And it stores for 9 months in a dark cabinet without refrigeration. Garlic is a one-time opt-out. Number 3. Kale. Kale has a reputation problem. It got turned into a joke by the health food industry, and now people associate it with expensive smoothies and lifestyle branding. But kale is a 10,000-year-old crop that survived because it doesn't stop producing, and it doesn't care if you forget about it. Kale is a cut-and-come-again crop. You don't harvest the plant, you harvest the leaves. The plant keeps growing. A single kale plant will produce for 6 to 8 months if you live in a temperate climate, and it will survive frost, snow, and freezing temperatures that kill everything else in your garden. In fact, kale tastes better after frost. Cold temperatures convert starches to sugars. It's one of the only crops that improves when the system collapses. During World War II, the British government promoted kale as part of the Dig for Victory campaign because it provided fresh greens through winter when nothing else would. It wasn't about nutrition trends, it was about seasonal coverage. If you could grow kale, you didn't need to import vegetables during the coldest months, which meant you didn't need to spend fuel or foreign currency on food security. In the American grocery system, kale became a premium product in the 2000s when the health food movement rebranded it. A pound of organic kale is now $3 to $5 depending on your market. That's not because kale is hard to grow, it's because organic certification is expensive and distribution markup is high. You're not paying for the plant, you're paying for the label and the logistics. If you grow kale, a single seed packet costs $2 and plants 50 starts. You'll have more kale than you can eat from April to November, and if you live somewhere with mild winters, it'll keep going until spring. The labor is almost zero. You water it once a week. You don't fertilize it, you don't spray it. It just grows. Kale is a plant that doesn't quit. Number 2. Onions. Onions are the invisible staple. They're in everything. But nobody thinks about them until they're not there. And right now, they're starting to not be there. In 2022, onion prices spiked 60% after droughts in the Pacific Northwest reduced commercial yields. It didn't last, but it was a preview. Onions are a high-water crop grown in concentrated geographic zones. Most of the onions sold in American supermarkets come from Washington, Oregon, and California. If those regions face compounding water restrictions or fuel cost increases, onion prices won't spike temporarily. They'll reset permanently. Onions have been a storage staple for 7,000 years. Ancient Mesopotamians grew them. Egyptians worshipped them. Medieval Europeans survived winters on them. They were adopted universally not because they were nutritious, but because they were possible. You could grow them in marginal soil, harvest them in late summer, and store them in a dry shed for 9 months without technology. A single onion set costs 4 cents. You plant it 2 inches deep in spring. 4 months later, you pull up a bulb the size of your fist. A 20-foot row of onion sets costs about $6 and produces 60 to 80 pounds of onions. That's a year's supply for a household, and the only input is the set and the ground. The supermarket onion is cheap until it isn't. Right now, a 3-pound bag of yellow onions is about $3. That's tolerable. But in 2022, it was $5.50. And it'll be $5.50 again the next time the wells run dry in eastern Oregon, or the next time diesel hits $6 a gallon. If you grow onions, you're outside that cycle. You're not waiting for the truck. You're not hoping the distributor has stock. You planted in April, and you're covered until next April. Onions are the crop that closes the gap. Number 1. Tomatoes. Tomatoes are the most grown home garden crop in the United States, and there's a reason that has nothing to do with trends. It's because tomatoes are the clearest, fastest evidence that the supermarket is selling you something that isn't the same thing. A tomato picked ripe off a vine has a sugar content and acid balance that doesn't exist in commercial agriculture. The tomatoes sold in supermarkets are harvested green, gassed with ethylene to turn them red, and shipped in refrigerated trucks that destroy their cellular structure. They look like tomatoes. They're not tomatoes. They're the idea of tomatoes shipped. The average American household buys about 30 pounds of fresh tomatoes per year at a cost of about $60. That's $2 a pound, and that price has been climbing steadily since 2020. But a single tomato plant produces 10 to 15 pounds of fruit across a summer. 4 plants will replace your household tomato spending entirely, and the cost is $4 in seedlings or 50 cents in seeds. Tomatoes were introduced to Europe from Central America in the 1500s and were considered poisonous for 200 years. They were ornamental plants. It wasn't until the late 1700s that Italians began eating them, and it wasn't until the 1800s that they became a food staple. By World War I, tomatoes were being canned industrially and distributed to troops. By the 1950s, they were a supermarket standard. But the breeding priority shifted. It was no longer about flavor. It was about shippability. Tomatoes were bred for thicker skins, for uniform ripening, for stacking tolerance. Flavor was sacrificed for logistics. And now the tomato you buy at the store is optimized for everything except the thing tomatoes are supposed to do, which is taste like something. If you grow tomatoes, you're not just saving money. You're opting out of a paradigm that chose durability over quality. You're growing food that was bred to be eaten, not shipped. And that's what all 7 of these crops have in common. They weren't designed for the supply chain. They were designed to keep people alive when the supply chain didn't exist. Right now, grocery prices aren't just rising. They're clarifying. They're showing you what happens when food becomes a logistical product instead of a fundamental resource. Every time diesel costs go up, food costs go up. Every time port congestion delays a shipment, prices go up. Every time a distributor raises margins to cover risk, you pay more. But these 7 crops don't ask the system for permission. They grow in average soil with average effort, and they produce more calories per square foot than almost anything being sold to you. They store without refrigeration. They propagate themselves. They don't require a PhD or a farm or perfect conditions. They require the decision to stop waiting for prices to go back to normal, because they're not going back. But you can go forward.